When I returned from a 5-year overseas assignment, I walked out of the airport expecting Dan Hill to finally keep his promise and propose to me. Instead, he stood there with a distant expression. Stella, I'm sorry. Before I could even process the apology, he continued. I was the one who arranged your transfer order. I deliberately had you reassigned to that remote project out in the desert because I needed space for Hayley and myself. She was pregnant back then, and I didn't have any other choice. A long silence followed, and I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. 5 years of scorching heat, endless dust storms, and 16-hour workdays in a place that felt forgotten by the rest of the world. I finally learned it had all been a carefully constructed prison of his making. You're overbearing and confrontational. I was afraid you'd go after her. I'm telling you the truth now, not because I expect forgiveness, but because I hope you'll stay calm and not make this uglier than it needs to be. His voice carried an air of weary resignation. I took a step back to avoid him as he reached out toward me. I was smiling through my tears. Dan, this could have been a clean break, but you've ruined that. Dan's car stayed behind my cab, and he flashed its headlights twice. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. Miss, that car has been following us. A friend of yours? I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth. No. Want me to lose him? It's fine. He knows where I'm going. The apartment building looked exactly the same as I remembered, aside from the new advertisements plastered inside the elevator. Dragging my suitcase behind me, I stopped at the door and pulled out my key. The sound of the lock turning was wrong. The door opened from the inside. Hayley Hill stood there in a silk nightgown with a little boy of 3 or 4 in her arms. You're back. The child wrapped his arms around her neck and looked at me curiously. Mom, who's this lady? She used to live here. Hayley gently patted his head before looking back at me. Would you like to come in? Dan told me you were coming back today. I just didn't expect you this early. I looked past her into the living room. Their wedding portrait hung on the wall, and the old couch had been replaced. There were children's clothes hanging out to dry on the balcony. This place. It's my home. Hayley cut me off with a soft and calm voice. It's been so for 5 years. The moment Dan got the apartment, he moved me in. The wheels of my suitcase halted in the doorway. He told me that we'd get married once you had gone to the desert. The boy began squirming impatiently, eager to get down and play. Hayley set him on the floor. He immediately ran toward a toy chest in the living room. Leaning against the doorframe, she studied me for a moment. You've lost a lot of weight. Those years out there must have been rough. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase. Is Dan coming back? No idea. She arched an eyebrow, a hint of mockery in her eyes. What do you need him for? Money. An explanation. I don't want either. Why have you come back then? I looked at her carefully maintained face and suddenly felt sick. I came back, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. To get my stuff back. Hayley sneered. What stuff could you possibly still have here? I threw out your clothes years ago. Dan said your books were taking up space, so he sold them. Oh, and those houseplants you kept? They all died. She paused, then added. I stopped watering them on purpose. I turned and pressed the elevator button. Her voice followed me from behind. Stella, don't make this uglier than it has to be. You have nothing now. You can't beat me. The elevator doors slid shut. I leaned back against the cold metal wall and closed my eyes. 5 years. I thought I had been climbing the ladder of my career. It turned out I had just been giving them their honeymoon. The next day, I visited the office to complete the paperwork for my return. When Linda Grazer from the Human Resources Department saw me, a complicated expression crossed her face. Stella, about your position. I know. Hayley took over while I was gone. I set my suitcase in the corner. It's fine. Just assign me a regular post. Linda sighed and pulled up my personnel file on her computer. Your 5 years in the desert are recorded here as a voluntary posting to support the border region, with successful completion of the mission despite harsh conditions. That's true. But, she lowered her voice. On the final reports for the 3 projects you led, every first author is listed as Hayley. I was stunned. How's that possible? Those were my. You signed off on it. Linda opened a document and turned the monitor toward me. Look. This agreement was filed 5 years ago. You signed it and approved shared ownership of the project results. The signature was mine. However, I had no memory of ever signing such a document. You were leaving in a hurry back then. A lot of the paperwork was handled by Mr. Hill on your behalf. Linda hesitated, as though considering whether to say more. Stella, there are some things. Never mind. You should head to your desk. My desk was tucked away in a corner beside the printer. Its surface was piled high with random office clutter. As co-workers passed by, some pretended not to see me. Others offered a brief nod in acknowledgement before moving on. Only Susan Brooks came over. How are you back? The project ended. Then you. She glanced toward Hayley's office. Be careful. She's the department head now, and Mr. Hill is her husband. I set my bag down. I know. That afternoon, my phone rang. Dan's name flashed across the screen. I ignored it. He called again and again. I answered on the fourth call. Stella, we need to talk. There's nothing to talk about. Hayley is pregnant with our second child. The doctor says the pregnancy is unstable, and she needs to avoid stress. He sounded exhausted. Could you stay away from us for a while? A child's voice echoed from somewhere in the background. Dad. Mom's throwing up again. Coming, buddy. Dan hurriedly spoke into the phone one last time. That's all. I'm asking you as a favor. He hung up. I stared at the dark screen and found myself thinking back to 5 years ago. The day the transfer order came through, I called Dan in tears. He had said, I'm on my way. Just wait for me. When he arrived, he pulled me into his arms and said, Go. Think of it as an opportunity. When you get back, we'll get married. That day, there had been a faint trace of perfume on him. It was not the cologne he usually wore. I finally knew why. It was Hayley's perfume. I went to the hospital for a full medical examination. The doctor frowned as he studied the report. Ms. Elba, your condition? Just tell me. Endometriosis. Your ovarian function has declined significantly. The doctor adjusted his glasses. The chances of conceiving naturally are close to 0. I gripped the report so tightly that the edge of the paper bit into my palm. Is it because of my working conditions? Years of high-intensity work, chronic stress, and the climate in the desert. The doctor paused. You're still young. If you start treatment now, there may still be a chance. I walked out of the examination room and into a hallway filled with expectant mothers. They sat with their hands resting on their swollen bellies. Their faces were glowing with quiet happiness. A husband knelt down and pressed his ear to his wife's stomach to listen for the baby's movement. I edged past them and pushed open the door to the emergency stairwell. The stairwell was empty. I crouched down and buried my face in my knees. I told myself not to cry. If I cried, it would mean they had won. 3 days later, the company held its annual gala. I had no intention of going, but Susan said, You're a long-time employee. It'll look bad if you don't show up. I wore a simple black dress and kept to a corner of the ballroom. The lights were bright, and the music was loud. When Dan and Hayley arrived together, they immediately became the center of attention. Mr. and Mrs. Hill, congratulations. A second baby. That's wonderful news. Hayley thanked everyone with a smile. Her hand never left her stomach. Dan kept an arm around her waist. Every time he looked down at her, his eyes were full of tenderness. Someone spotted me and subtly nodded in my direction. The room fell quiet for a brief moment. Then the chatter resumed as if nothing had happened. With one hand resting on her pregnant belly, Hayley made her way toward me. Stella, it's been a long time. I held my glass of champagne. Congratulations. Thank you. She gently rubbed her stomach. We consulted a psychic. She said it would be a girl, and Dan was over the moon. He said he hoped our daughter would take after her mother. She looked at me and suddenly lowered her voice. You know, Dan said if he hadn't sent you away, he probably would have stayed torn between us for a long time. What are you trying to say? What I'm saying is, she smiled sweetly, thank you for stepping aside back then. Without your sacrifice, we wouldn't have the life we have today. My hand was trembling. A few drops of champagne splashed out and stained my dress. Hayley, do you know that when you were pregnant with your first child, I was out there working in freezing temperatures, running a dangerously high fever, and almost died? I looked her straight in the eyes. She blinked. What about it? I called him 17 times and he never answered. It was our anniversary. She smiled. He was helping me choose a wedding gown. I took a deep breath. Then, she added, it was a limited edition Vera Wang gown. The one with the pearl embroidery around the waist. I had tried that gown on 5 years ago. Back then, Dan had said, we'll buy this for our wedding. It turned out that when he said we, he had never meant me and him. I set down my glass and turned to leave. At some point, Dan had appeared behind us. He looked at me with a mixture of emotions in his eyes. Stella. Don't say my name, it makes me sick. I cut him off. I walked out of the ballroom. Rain was falling outside. I stood beneath the eaves and watched the downpour blur the city into a single gray haze. Footsteps sounded behind me. Dan had followed me out. He held an umbrella in his hand and offered it to me. Take it. You'll catch a cold. Why do you care? He fell silent for a moment. I know you hate me. I don't hate you. I said, I just think I wasted 5 years on someone who wasn't worth it. Those 5 years. I cut him off. I worked 16-hour days during those 5 years in the middle of nowhere. My period stopped for months at a time. My hair was falling out in handfuls. I endured all of it because I kept telling myself that I would finally marry you when I came back. The color drained from his face. As for you, in those same 5 years you got married, had a child, and now, you're expecting another. I let out a laugh. I'm sorry. What good is your apology? I looked straight at him. Dan, You've made it impossible even to hate you. You've made me feel like a fool. The rain came down harder. He opened the umbrella and tried to angle it over me. I pushed his hand away and stepped into the downpour. The rain was freezing, and it soaked through my clothes within seconds. 1 week later, I received a call from home. Mom was crying on the phone. Stella, your dad's in the hospital. I rushed home immediately. My father, who had struggled with heart disease for years, lay in the hospital bed with a gray, ashen face. Mom grabbed my hand. Someone sent your dad a letter. It said that you were the other woman and that you broke up someone's family. I did no such thing. There were photos. Mom wiped away her tears. They included text messages between you and Dan. There were even statements from people at your company. I snatched the envelope. The photographs inside were doctored, and the chat logs were fabricated. However, they were alarmingly convincing. Dad, please let me explain. Dad opened his eyes and looked at me for a long moment. I believe you, he said. Then he closed his eyes. A shrill alarm erupted from the heart monitor. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room. I was pushed out of the ward. Outside the door, Dan stood there. He held a fruit basket in his hands. I came to see Mr. Elba, he said. A nurse passed by and murmured under her breath, Mr. Hill is such a good man. He even visits his ex-girlfriend's father. I stared at him before I snapped. I lunged forward and slapped him. The fruit basket fell to the floor, and fruit rolled everywhere. You did this. I don't know what. You don't know? I grabbed the front of his shirt. Those photos. Those messages. Who else could have sent them besides you? He grabbed my wrists. Stella, calm down. How am I supposed to calm down? I screamed at him. If anything happens to Dad, I'm going to kill you. The ward door opened. The doctor stepped out and removed his mask. I'm sorry. We did everything we could. In that moment, my world shattered. The funeral was held 3 days later. My mother would not let me through the door. Go away, she said through the closed door. Your dad wouldn't want to see you. I stood and waited outside from morning until night. In the afternoon, Dan and Hayley arrived. They placed a white lily arrangement near the front of the chapel. The card attached to it read, with deepest sympathy, Dan and Hayley Hill. Hayley noticed me and spoke softly. My condolences. I looked at Dan. If looks could kill, he would have dropped dead where he stood. The color drained from his face. Hayley tugged gently on his sleeve. Come on. We should go. Without another word, they turned and walked away. Mom finally opened the door. When she looked at me, all I saw in her eyes was hatred. Are you happy now? Your dad is dead. Happy now. I stepped forward and tried to hug her. Mom, don't touch me. She shoved me away. I don't want a daughter like you. I stayed there frozen and unable to move. A week after my father's funeral, I received a call from the company. Stella, your employment has been terminated. The voice from the Human Resources Department was cold and detached. The grounds are gross misconduct and breach of professional ethics. During your assignment in the desert, you allegedly engaged in inappropriate relationships with multiple male colleagues. I rushed straight to the office and stormed into the Human Resources office. Where is your evidence? The Human Resources Director tossed a stack of photographs onto the desk. They were ordinary job site photos of me and my co-workers. However, they were overlaid with obscene and defamatory captions. This is defamation. Where there is smoke, there is fire. The director looked at me as he said, the company cannot tolerate an employee like you. So I went to see Dan. His assistant stopped me outside his office. Mr. Hill is in a meeting. I waited until nightfall. When he finally stepped out of the conference room, his steps faltered the moment he saw me. I know what you're going to say, he said. It's the company's decision. There's nothing I can do. Dan, you framed me. It wasn't me. He frowned. Hayley said. And you just believe whatever she tells you? I stepped closer. She killed my father. Now she's trying to destroy me. Are you going to help her do that too? He took a step back. Stella, you need to calm down. I'm perfectly calm, I said. I just want to know one thing. Can you really live with yourself? He did not answer. I turned and left. As I reached the ground floor, a crowd suddenly closed in around me. 7 or 8 people stood there holding signs. Homewrecker. Which? Get out of our town. Someone threw something at me. It was a bucket of red paint. It drenched me from top to bottom. I stood there motionless as I dripped crimson from head to toe. Dan's car emerged from the underground garage and stopped at the curb. He got out and dispersed those people. Then he looked at me and sighed. Stella, why can't you just take the high road? Why does it have to come to this? I wiped my face. The red ran down my fingers in streaks. Take the high road? I laughed. How exactly am I supposed to do that? He said nothing. He got back into his car and drove away. When I got back to my apartment, I found that the locks had been changed. My luggage had been dumped outside the door. The landlord poked his head out. I packed up your things. You need to leave. Why? Someone filed a complaint against you. People are saying you are the kind of person who brings trouble wherever she goes. It's bad for the building." The landlord waved his hand. "I'm not renting out to you anymore." I crouched down beside my suitcase. It was the same suitcase I had taken with me to the desert 5 years ago. It was the same one I had brought back. Nothing had seemingly changed, yet everything had. I spent the entire night nursing a cold cup of coffee in an all-night diner. The city awoke in the morning light. It was beautiful. However, I no longer wished to remain here a moment longer. The shower in the $20 a night motel room smelled faintly of rust and industrial bleach. I stood under the scalding water for 40 minutes, scrubbing at my skin with a stiff nylon sponge until the water running down the drain turned from a muddy, dried crimson back to clear. The red paint Hayley's hired mob had thrown at me came off in sticky flakes, but the sting on my raw skin remained. When I finally stepped out, my reflection in the fogged mirror looked like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. My hair was wet and heavy, my face hollowed out by 5 years of desert dust and 3 weeks of grief. I sat on the edge of the creaky mattress and opened my suitcase. Beneath the thin cotton shirts and faded work pants lay a battered olive drab hard case. It was a military-grade, shockproof external drive, the kind we used in the desert to protect data from dust storms, extreme temperatures, and power surges. Dan had managed the administrative side of the company's headquarters. He had filed the forged transfer orders, altered the personnel files, and helped Hayley claim my name on the final project submissions. He believed that because he controlled the central server in the air-conditioned office on the 24th floor, he controlled reality. He had forgotten one simple rule about engineers who survive 5 years in a wasteland: we keep our own logs. I plugged the drive into my old laptop. The fan whirred loudly in the quiet room. On that drive were 5 years of daily site logs, raw sensor data, time-stamped video walkthroughs, digital sign-off sheets with biometric signatures, and recorded satellite calls. Every time I had repaired a structural flaw in the desert pipeline, every time I had signed off on a concrete pour at 3 in the morning while nursing a 102-degree fever, the system had logged my unique biometric hash. Hayley had her name on the published papers, but she didn't have the raw calculations. She didn't have the stress-strain analysis data. She didn't even know what alloy we had used for the high-pressure valves in Sector 4 because I had modified the specifications on-site to survive the alkali soil. My phone chimed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. "Stella, this is Susan. I shouldn't be sending this from my work phone, but I used a burner app. Hayley went into the archive room today and pulled all your physical blue books from the desert assignment. She's trying to clear out the hard copies. If you're going to do something, do it fast." I stared at the message. A cold, steady calm settled over me. The pain behind my ribs didn't disappear, but it narrowed into something sharp and precise. I didn't reply to Susan. Instead, I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. The line rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Vance." "Director Vance," I said, my voice steady. "This is Stella Elba." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the faint rustle of papers being set down. "Stella, I heard you were back in the Central District. I tried reaching out through your department last week, but Hill told me you were on extended medical leave." "I'm not on leave," I said plainly. "I've been terminated for gross misconduct. My father is dead because of a targeted defamation campaign, and the 5 years of structural reports your board approved for the National Energy Grid were submitted under a fraudulent author's name." Silence stretched over the line for 3 long seconds. Arthur Vance was the chief auditor of the State Infrastructure Oversight Board. 3 years ago, when a severe sandstorm threatened to collapse the primary foundation of the Sector 2 transformer station, Vance had flown out to the desert himself. He had watched me spend 48 continuous hours in a harness, welding the support trusses, in 60-mile-an-hour winds while Dan was in the Capitol attending dinner parties. "Where are you right now, Stella?" Vance's voice had lost its casual tone. It was now hard as iron. "A motel on 4th Street, I replied. "And I have the raw biometric logs for the entire 5-year deployment." "Stay where you are," Vance said. "I'm sending a car. And I'm bringing Evelyn Sterling with me." I didn't need to ask who Evelyn Sterling was. Everyone in the energy sector knew her name. She was the senior litigator for the Federal Trade Commission's Corporate Integrity Division, the woman who had dismantled 3 major contractor cartels in the last decade. I closed my laptop, stood up, and looked out the small, grimy motel window at the neon city lights. Dan wanted me to take the high road. He wanted me to go quietly into the night, so he could play the devoted husband and rising executive. I rested my palm against the cool glass. "Dad," I whispered into the quiet room. "Watch me." 2 hours later, I was sitting in the high-ceilinged conference room of Sterling and Associates on the top floor of the financial center. Evelyn Sterling sat across from me. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp gray eyes, iron gray hair cut into an immaculate bob, and a tailored navy suit that screamed precision. Beside her, Director Vance sat with his hands folded over a thick leather binder. On the mahogany table between us lay my military-grade hard drive, alongside the stack of documents Linda from HR had shown me 3 days ago. Evelyn picked up a magnifying glass and examined the signature on the 5-year-old shared ownership agreement. This document is dated October 14th, 5 years ago, Evelyn said, her voice smooth and dry like aged parchment. The timestamp on the filing system shows it was uploaded at 2:14 p.m. from an IP address registered to North Tech Group's central office. She looked up at me. Where were you on October 14th at 2:14 p.m.? I opened my laptop and pulled up a satellite transit log. I was aboard a military transport flight to the desert site. I was in international airspace, with zero network connectivity from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Here is the flight manifest certified by the Ministry of Transportation. Evelyn's lips curved into a faint, predatory line. So Dan Hill signed your name, using a digital signature pad he had access to while you were literally miles above the earth. Yes. That isn't just an administrative dispute, Stella, Evelyn said, leaning back. That is grand larceny of intellectual property, corporate forgery, and wire fraud involving a government-funded infrastructure project. If these reports were submitted to the State Oversight Board under a false name to secure Hayley Hill's promotion to department head, it constitutes fraud against the state. Director Vance tapped his heavy fingers on the table. North Tech Group is scheduled to present the final safety certification for the Desert Energy Grid to my board this Thursday. Dan Hill is up for the Vice President of Operations position. The board was prepared to approve both. Not anymore, I said softly. Evelyn picked up another file, the one containing the photos of the smear campaign, the doctored messages, and the red paint incident. This is the personal side, Evelyn said, her gaze softening slightly with a cold, focused sympathy. The police report you filed after your father's cardiac arrest was dismissed as a civil dispute by the local precinct. That precinct's commander happens to be a college classmate of Dan Hill's father. My hands clenched into fists in my lap. I knew it. We've already issued a formal request to transfer the investigation to the State Cybercrime Division, Evelyn continued, pulling a crisp white folder toward her. My private investigator traced the digital footprint of the smear mail sent to your father. The photos were uploaded to a commercial printing service 3 blocks from North Tech's headquarters. The credit card used to pay for the order was a supplementary corporate card issued to Hayley Hill. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She used company funds, I whispered, the sheer absurdity and malice of it settling in to murder my father. Legally, proving murder or manslaughter will be complex, Evelyn noted. Precisely. However, intentional infliction of emotional distress leading to wrongful death, aggravated harassment, and misuse of corporate assets? We will destroy her in civil court, and the state prosecutor will handle the rest. She closed her folder with a quiet thud. Stella, I need to ask you one thing before we proceed. Once we launch this, there will be no out-of-court settlements. There will be no quiet resignations. Dan Hill and Hayley Hill will face total professional annihilation and potential prison time. Are you prepared for the noise? I looked down at my hands. The skin on my knuckles was still pink and tender from scrubbing away the red paint. I thought of my father lying in that cold hospital room, his eyes closing as the monitor shrilled into a flat line. I thought of my mother's voice through the locked door, filled with poison that wasn't hers. I looked back up into Evelyn's sharp gray eyes. I didn't come back from the desert to ask for a compromise, I said. I came back to collect what is mine. On Thursday morning, the Grand Conference Hall of the State Infrastructure Oversight Board was filled with industry executives, press reporters, and senior government officials. Huge digital banners hung from the balcony walls. North Tech Group, powering the future. Dan Hill stood near the podium, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a dark blue silk tie, and a silver watch that caught the chandelier light. He looked relaxed, polished, and victorious. Beside him stood Hayley, dressed in an elegant cream-colored maternity dress that subtly highlighted her baby bump. He smiled gracefully at the cameras, accepting congratulations from senior board members. Mr. Hill, congratulations on the imminent approval of the Desert Grid project. A reporter from Industry Weekly said, pushing a microphone forward. Word is that your wife played a pivotal role in the technical design during her time as project head. Dan placed a gentle, loving hand on Hayley's shoulder. Hayley's dedication to this company and this country's energy future is unmatched. even while raising our son and carrying our second child. She never stopped overseeing the core engineering protocols. Hayley offered a modest, sweet smile. It was a team effort. We all made sacrifices. Sacrifices, a calm, clear voice echoed from the rear entrance of the hall. That's an interesting word for someone who has never set foot in Sector 4. The chatter in the room evaporated instantly. Cameras pivoted toward the double doors. I walked down the central aisle. I was not wearing the faded clothes from the desert, nor the simple black dress from the gala. I wore a charcoal gray, double-breasted suit tailored to perfection, my dark hair pulled back into a tight, slick knot. Behind me walked Evelyn Sterling, flanked by 4 uniformed officers from the State Cybercrime Division and 2 senior auditors carrying heavy black leather cases. Don Esmail froze. The color drained from his face so fast it was as if he'd been struck. Hayley's hand dropped from her stomach, her sweet expression fracturing into a mask of pure fury. Stella, what is the meaning of this? This is a private government certification hearing. Security. Security won't be necessary, Mrs. Hill. Director Vance's voice thundered over the hall's PA system as he stepped out from the executive holding room onto the main stage. He didn't take his seat at the head of the panel. Instead, he stood beside the main screen. This hearing is officially suspended under Order 402 of the State Infrastructure Integrity Act, Vance announced loudly. His voice echoed through the silent room. A formal petition for fraud, identity theft, and corporate sabotage has been lodged against North Tech Group, specifically targeting the credentials of the Desert Energy Grid project. Muttering erupted among the press. Camera flashes began to explode like strobe lights. Dan stepped forward, his voice tight, trying to maintain his calm, authoritative demeanor. Director Vance, this is ridiculous. If this is about Ms. Elba's termination, that was an internal HR matter regarding professional ethics. Mr. Hill, Evelyn Sterling interrupted, her heels clicking crisply against the marble floor as she stepped up to the podium. I suggest you refrain from making further statements regarding Ms. Elba's termination. Every document related to that termination has already been seized under a federal search warrant issued 1 hour ago at your corporate headquarters. Hayley took a sharp breath, taking a step back toward Dan. Dan, what is she talking about? Evelyn signaled to one of her aides, who connected an encrypted drive to the hall's primary media console. The massive wall screens behind the podium flickered, replacing the glossy North Tech promotional video with a stark, split-screen document display. On the left was the official patent and project authorship form bearing Hayley Hill's signature, dated 5 years ago. On the right was a satellite tracking grid overlaid with biometric verification logs. As you can see, Evelyn's voice carried to every corner of the room with absolute razor-sharp clarity. The core algorithm for the desert grid's thermal expansion balance was uploaded to the state server using Ms. Stella Elba's personal biometric key on August 12, 3 years ago, at 3:14 a.m. local desert time. At that exact moment, Mrs. Hayley Hill was registered at the St. Regis luxury resort in Bali on a private vacation funded by Mr. Dan Hill's corporate expense account. Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters were typing furiously on their tablets. That proves nothing. Hayley snapped, her voice losing its sweet edge, turning shrill. I delegated the on-site data entry to field technicians. That's standard administrative protocol. I stepped forward, stopping 5 feet from her. Is that so, Hayley? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Then perhaps you can explain to the oversight board right now the formula we used to calculate the fluid dynamic pressure under high alkali soil conditions in Sector 4. Hayley stared at me, her mouth slightly open. It's in Section 3 of your published paper. I continued, taking another step. You're the primary author. You signed off on it. What is the correction? Coefficient for thermal expansion at 60 degrees Celsius. Hayley's eyes darted frantically toward Dan. Dan opened his mouth. Stella, this isn't the venue for a technical quiz. It is precisely the venue. Director Vance slammed his hand on the desk. This board is about to authorize a $4 billion infrastructure grant based on those exact calculations. If the primary author cannot answer a fundamental engineering question about her own paper, then this entire submission is a dangerous, fraudulent lie. Hayley's chest rose and fell rapidly. Sweat broke out along her hairline, ruining her carefully set makeup. The technical details were managed by the subcontractors. I was in charge of overall project direction. You weren't in charge of anything, I said coldly. You were sitting in my old apartment, sleeping in my bed, wearing a gown meant for me, while I was breathing sand and bleeding for 5 years. You stole my name because you didn't have the brains to build one of your own. You arrogant bitch. Hayley shrieked, dropping all pretense of elegance. She lunged toward me, her manicured nails reaching for my face. Before she could touch me, 2 uniformed state officers stepped between us, grabbing her arms and locking them behind her back. Get your hands off me, Hayley screamed, thrashing against the officer's iron grip. Do you know who I am? Dan, tell them. Tell them to let me go. Dan stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror as he looked from Hayley to the wall. Screens, where more documents were popping up in rapid succession. Evelyn Sterling didn't pause. She signaled the media console again. The main screen changed. The engineering schematics disappeared, replaced by high-resolution bank statements, IP routing logs, and printing shop receipts. In addition to the state fraud charges, Evelyn stated, her voice icy and relentless, the state cybercrime division has issued arrest warrants for Hayley Hill and Dan Hill regarding a malicious, organized campaign of criminal defamation and harassment that directly resulted in the wrongful death of Mr. Robert Elba. The press went completely wild. Photographers climbed onto chairs to get shots of Dan and Hayley. The IP address used to coordinate the smear campaign against Ms. Elba was traced directly to the home Wi-Fi network registered to Dan Hill. Evelyn announced, looking directly at the news cameras. The physical materials, including the fabricated photographs sent to Mr. Elba's home during his critical medical recovery, were paid for using a credit card under Dan Hill's name and picked up by Hayley Hill. Dan's head snapped toward Hayley, his face turning an ashen gray. What? Hayley, you told me those letters were just... You said you didn't know anything about those photos. Shut up, Dan. Hayley spat, her voice trembling with hysteria. You knew. You wanted her gone just as much as I did. You forged her signature 5 years ago. You put her on that plane. I did that to protect you. Dan yelled back, his composure completely shattering in front of the entire National Press Corps. I gave her project to you so you could get the promotion. I did everything for you, and you used my credit card to send death threats to her father. You spineless coward. Hayley screamed, her eyes bulging. You loved having us both. You loved keeping her in the desert like a dog while you brought me into her house. Don't you dare act innocent now. The shouting match between the couple was captured by 30 high-definition cameras, broadcasting live across every major network in the state. The illusion of their perfect, loving family was torn to shreds in less than 3 minutes. Dan turned frantically to Director Vance, his hands shaking violently as he tried to adjust his tie. Director, please. I was misled. I didn't know the extent of Hayley's actions. I was just trying to manage an internal HR conflict. Mr. Hill, Director Vance said, looking at him with absolute disgust. Save your speeches for the grand jury. The lead cybercrime officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Dan Hill, Hayley Hill, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, wire fraud, criminal forgery, and conspiracy to commit aggravated harassment, the officer read cold and fast. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The steel cuffs clicked shut around Dan's wrists first. As the metal touched his skin, Dan seemed to deflate completely. The polished, ambitious rising executive vanished, leaving behind a weak, terrified man whose knees buckled so badly the officers had to hold him upright. Hayley fought all the way to the door, screaming profanities at me, at the police, and at Dan, until her voice went raw and the heavy doors finally closed behind them. The hall fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Every lens in the room was now pointed at me. Evelyn Sterling stepped back from the podium, making space. Director Vance nodded to me softly. I stood before the microphones. I looked out at the sea of flashbulbs, at the reporters who had ignored my existence 3 days ago, and at the wall screen that now displayed my name, and my name alone, next to the Desert Energy Grid project. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. 5 years ago, I said, my voice carrying cleanly through the static of the room. I was sent into the desert to be forgotten. Today, I came back to remind you that foundations built on sand will always collapse. The fallout over the next 48 hours was a catastrophic landslide that flattened North Tech Group's executive board. By Friday afternoon, North Tech's stock had plummeted 62%. The board of directors held an emergency session, firing Dan Hill and Hayley Hill, effective immediately, stripping them of all stock options, and launching an internal forensic audit of every project Dan had touched in his 7-year tenure. The city prosecutor filed 24 felony counts against the couple because of the federal involvement through the State Infrastructure Oversight Board. Bail was set at $5 million each. Neither of them could pay it. Their bank accounts had been frozen by a court order attached to my civil lawsuit. On Saturday morning, I stood outside the gates of the Municipal Detention Center with Evelyn Sterling. Dan's attorney requested a private meeting with you before the formal arraignment, Evelyn said, checking her watch. You don't have to see him, Stella. We have them completely pinned. I know, I replied, pulling my coat tighter against the chilly morning wind. Want to see him? The visitation room was cold, smelling of stale floor wax and old coffee. When Dan was let in by a guard, I almost didn't recognize him. He was wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit. His hair was greasy and uncombed, his cheeks hollowed out, and the posture of the confident, polished man I had loved for 5 years was entirely gone. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his hands cuffed in front of him. He sat down across the scratched plexiglass divider, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the metal table. Stella. His voice came through the small speaker, raspy and thin. Thank you for coming. I didn't speak. I sat quietly, watching him like a scientist observing an insect under a microscope. I spoke to my lawyer, Dan stammered, his eyes darting nervously to my face. They're talking about 7 to 10 years in state prison, Stella. 7 to 10 years. My life will be over. My son won't even know who I am. You should have thought about your son before you forged my signature 5 years ago, I said quietly. I didn't want to hurt you, he burst out, pressing his face closer to the glass. Tears welled up in his bloodshot eyes. You have to believe me, Stella. 5 years ago, when Hayley told me she was pregnant, I panicked. You were always so strong, so independent, so focused on your career. I thought you didn't really need me. But Hayley was fragile. She cried, she begged me. I thought I was doing the right thing by giving her a chance. I let out a soft, dry laugh. You thought throwing me into a desert for 5 years to rot was doing the right thing? I thought you'd come back after a few years, we'd settle things, and you'd move on, he cried out, his voice cracking. I didn't know Hayley was going to send those letters to your father. I swear to God, Stella, I didn't know she paid those people to throw paint on you. She used my card while I was at work. It doesn't matter what you knew, Dan, I said, my tone flat and unyielding. You laid the first brick of that trap. You built the cage. She just locked the door. Dan pressed his forehead against the cold glass, weeping openly now. Please, Stella, talk to the prosecutor. Tell them to drop the conspiracy charges against me. I'll testify against Hayley. I'll give them everything on her. Just help me get probation. I'll give you back the apartment. I'll give you every cent I have left. I leaned forward slightly, looking straight into his broken, weeping face. Do you remember what you told me at the airport when I got off that plane? I asked softly. He blinked through his tears, shaking his head numbly. I hope you'll stay calm and not make this uglier than it needs to be. I recited every word with surgical precision. You thought my quietness was weakness. Done. You thought because I didn't scream or make a scene at the terminal, I was just going to accept the bone you threw me and fade away. I stood up, buttoning my coat. I am perfectly calm, I said. And this isn't ugly. This is just justice. Stella, don't leave. Stella, please, he begged, slamming his handcuffed fists against the glass as the guard stepped forward to grab his shoulders. Stella. I turned my back on him and walked out the door without looking back once. 2 days later, I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs. The small brick house looked quiet under the autumn trees. The flower beds my father had tended were covered in fallen leaves. I stood on the porch for a long time before I finally knocked on the door. The door opened slowly. My mother stood there. In just 2 weeks, she seemed to have aged 10 years. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling as she held the edge of the door frame. In her hands was a newspaper. The front page featured a massive headline. North Tech executives arrested in fraud and harassment scheme. Former field engineer exonerated. She looked at me, her lips trembling, tears spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. Stella. Her voice was a broken whisper. I didn't step inside. The police visited you yesterday, didn't they? They showed me the investigation files, Mom sobbed, taking a shaking step forward, reaching out her hands toward me. The letters, the photos sent to your father. It was all that horrible woman. You didn't do anything, you never hurt anyone. She covered her face with her hands, sinking to her knees right there on the porch, weeping uncontrollably. Oh God, Stella, what did I say to you? What did I do to you at the funeral? Your father would have hated me for treating you like that. I stood on the step above her, watching her shoulders shake. A part of me wanted to kneel down, wrap my arms around her, and cry until the ache in my chest went away. But another part of me, the part that had forged itself in 5 years of desert dust and betrayal, remained standing tall and still. Pain doesn't disappear just because the truth comes out. Forgiveness isn't an automatic switch you flip when someone finally realizes they were wrong. I knelt down slowly, taking her cold, shaking hands in mine. Dad believed me, I said softly, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Before he closed his eyes, he told me he believed me. He did, Mom wept, looking up at me with eyes full of unbearable guilt. He told me to trust you. And I didn't. I was so angry, so broken by his heart attack. I let them use me to hurt you. I don't hate you, Mom, I said gently, wiping a tear from her cheek. But I need time. I need to rebuild my life before I can come back here. She nodded frantically, squeezing my hands with all her remaining strength. I understand. I understand, Stella. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I helped her stand up, guided her back inside the house, and set a cup of warm tea on the table for her. Before I left, I went into my father's study. His desk was just as he had left it, his reading glasses resting beside a wooden clock, his books neatly arranged on the shelves. I took the silver engineering medal I had won during my first year in the desert out of my pocket and placed it beside his reading glasses. I cleared my name, Dad. I whispered to the empty room. Rest easy. 6 months later, the high-profile trial of State versus Hill, and Hill concluded with a decisive verdict that dominated the national news for a week. Dan Hill was sentenced to 6 years in state prison for corporate fraud, wire fraud, and felony conspiracy. His tearful pleas for leniency were rejected by the judge, who cited his callous disregard for human life and systematic abuse of corporate authority. Hayley Hill received 9 years in a maximum security women's facility for grand theft of intellectual property, aggravated cyber harassment resulting in death, and perjury. Her second child was born under medical supervision shortly before her trial concluded and was placed into the custody of her sister. The apartment where I had once lived was auctioned off under a court order to pay part of the $5 million civil judgment I won against them. I didn't buy it back. I had no desire to live among those ghosts. Instead, I used the settlement money and the back pay royalties awarded to me by North Tech Group to establish the Elba Engineering Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal protection, physical safety resources, and career advocacy for female engineers working on remote, high-risk industrial sites. I stood on the glass balcony of my new office on the 35th floor of the State Innovation Center. The evening sun was setting over the city, painting the skyline in brilliant shades of amber, gold, and deep purple. Below, the streets were alive with glowing headlights and bustling crowds. My phone rang on the glass desk behind me. I walked back inside and picked it up. Stella Elba. Ms. Elba, Director Vance's warm, energetic voice came through the speaker. The Ministry of Energy just signed off on the Sector 5 expansion contract. The board voted unanimously to appoint your foundation as the primary technical oversight consultant. I smiled, looking out at the golden horizon. Thank you, Director Vance. My team will have the first site assessment ready by Monday. Take a break this weekend, Stella, Vance laughed softly. You've worked hard. Enough for 3 lifetimes. I will, I promised. I hung up the phone and walked over to the corner of my office. There, sitting on a polished white pedestal under a warm spotlight, was a simple glass terrarium. Inside, thriving in rich dark soil, was a healthy green desert rose plant, a cutting I had brought back with me from Sector 4 in my battered toolkit. It had survived the heat, the sandstorms, and the cold nights of the wasteland. And now, under my care, it was blooming with vibrant, deep crimson flowers. I touched one of the delicate petals lightly with my fingertip. The desert had tried to bury me. They had forgotten that I was a seed.